Good afternoon. So welcome back to the Jarden Decarbonisation Conference. I'm Neville Goliath. I'm a utility sector analyst here at Jarden in Wellington. Just a reminder about the housekeeping, sort of on your tab on the page in front of you. Just there's some information which gives sort of a bio for the presenters and sort of our agenda. And just to the right of that is the Q&A button. So if you type your questions in there, I'll relay them on to our presenter today. So on to our presenter. We're delighted to have Gary Holden with us. He's the Managing Director at Lodestone Energy, which is about to build New Zealand's largest solar PV project. And I think it's fair to say, or to describe Gary as sort of world famous within the New Zealand power industry. In the very early days of our market, he put together New Zealand's largest electricity and gas retailing business. Most recently, he was the CEO of Pulse Energy, one of our larger independent retailers, electricity retailers. And the new Lodestone venture that he's going to talk about today is notable for at least two reasons. One is developing New Zealand's first really grid-scale solar PV site or sites, and it'll be New Zealand's first independent generator in the last decade or so. So I think Gary can offer us a unique perspective to New Zealand's decarbonisation efforts. So without further ado, welcome Gary, over to you.
Well, thank you very much, Neville. It's a pleasure to be here today. I look forward to sharing a little bit about Lodestone and some of the reflections that I have on the New Zealand market, and then we'll go for some questions. Just to start with, it's useful talking about New Zealand solar market. It is a new market. There's been a number of rooftop systems, something like 10,000, put into the market over the last 5 years, but the step we're about to take to put grid scale solar is kind of a big step change, and one of the differences in the New Zealand market compared to other markets around the world is it really is based on pure market principles. There's no government interference. There's no feed-in tariffs. There's no government renewable standard RFPs that go on. It's purely bilateral discussions between the parties, and for that reason, it's probably the purest way to introduce solar into a market with pure free market signals. The other rather good thing, or unique thing maybe, is the interconnection side of the market has been very well designed. We've learned a lot here in New Zealand about what other markets have done on interconnection, and interconnecting distributed generation has been a bit of a problem for electricity markets. But we had the opportunity to have the foresight to write rules that basically rely on one key principle, which is a distributed generator, as long as it's willing to pay its incremental cost to enter the market, then the network participant on the other side of the transaction is obliged to take them on board. And that means when you combine the free market principles and the interconnection rules, that entrepreneurial ideas to bring generation to the market are openly welcomed. The other interesting thing about the market is it's also very free and open on the retail side, and so an independent generator like Lodestone could take its generation product directly to the retail side of the market, and very good nodal prices and daytime, nighttime price signaling. That entry is pretty straightforward and easy to do. And then finally, the market is also noted for how the half-hourly price gets derived. It's generally, particularly during the peak period, generally driven by gas prices and the cost of carbon in the market. And so an energy source like solar can benefit from a nice clear daytime signal, but also some comfort in knowing that the price has some foundation based in fossil fuel and carbon costs. And that does lead you then to think that as long as carbon and gas are in the market, and there is a free and open access to the market, that solar will essentially propagate and propagate well and very naturally. We in sort of gauging the scale of what the other technologies are in the market and the relativity to solar, it looks very much like 3,000 to 5,000 gigawatt hours of solar would ultimately find its way into the market. So our solution, our Lodestone solution, is to build at scale, find interconnection points that have some spare capacity. Make sure those interconnection points with spare capacity are in very sunny places, but also because land is quite high value in most of rural New Zealand, make sure that we're doing whatever we can to maintain the underlying purpose for that land and keep the farming alive. And so we're essentially building the business around solar farms that have a kind of a blank canvas of a farm that we could lease out to farming operations, and that farming operation could be anything from running sheep across the land, or perhaps even mixed use horticulture. And so one of the hallmarks of the Lodestone plan is to continue to keep the land alive and well as a productive farm. We're picking bifacial tracking technology, so the reflective light off the grass is captured in generation production, and the tracking, of course, creates a very flat load profile so that we maximize the daytime production and do our best to hit high price periods in the half-hour market. In terms of solar, everyone who follows the solar market know this, but it's definitely true in New Zealand that solar technology over the last 10 years has effectively moved from being 4 or 5 times out of the money 10 years ago to the cheapest source of energy available now. And the advantage of being the lowest cost production and having a free market to access the highest value is really the magic that has triggered now this next wave of solar development in the country. This graph here is essentially a monthly graph broken, and a sort of on the vertical is the daytime time periods. Nighttime period prices and daytime period prices in New Zealand are quite repeatable and known. The prices that solar would get are quite a bit higher than the prices at night. And so this has 2 major advantages. Obviously, with solar being the lowest cost production and the highest value possibility, that makes solar probably more economic than any other generation in this market. The 24-hour price is sort of, would be an average of these time periods, and that would be typically what revenue a wind farm would get. And so solar benefiting from the higher price periods would make it comparatively more economic than wind technology. The other interesting thing about this graph that's working is this stratification of prices is also what makes battery technology naturally economic as well. The ability to put in a battery system, buy at the low end of the scale, and then sell at a higher price period later in the day is a fundamental, transparent way to invest in battery technology. In terms of how Lodestone and other solar generators might make their money, instead of simply taking the half-hour, there is the opportunity in this market to take the retail price. And you can see from this graph, this is the 20-year or 15-year picture of retail prices in New Zealand, and one of the one of the interesting things about this market is in any given year, there's relatively high volatility driven by the amount of rainfall that the hydro lakes get. And so with high volatility, you would think that there was naturally some volatility in the market at the retail side, and that actually is not true. The retail market is very stable, and that is because the most of the retail market is fed from hedges that are at least 1 year in advance of the annual volatility. And so the opportunity for a solar farm is to essentially sell solar at a retail based price and lock in higher margins than you would if you were simply taking the half hour price and the volatility that goes along with it. So our plan is to essentially take the output from our solar farms and sell them directly into the retail market. Just stepping back a little bit, I'll just going to talk about some of the basic advantages in selling retail. It comes into focus just how does grid scale solar power compare to rooftop solar power. Rooftop solar in New Zealand is also sold through retail energy contracts, and that's been a very successful way to sell solar in New Zealand. But the price of the rooftop solar about $2.80 a watt, and our grid scale solar farms are $1.20. So the ability to take grid scale solar and its economies of scale in the retail market is presents a great consumer choice, because consumers would either consider putting rooftop solar themselves or buy from a retailer serving up grid scale power. I mentioned earlier about tracking and bifacial. This graph here is a representation of the shape of the production, the winter months being the lower production months and the summer months being higher. And you can see for each of the 12 months, there's pretty much a repeatable, nicely shaped production profile that matches the high value period in the morning and starts to chip the expensive value or the highest period in the evening. And then the introduction of batteries into this scenario would allow some of that afternoon period shift into the evening. And so that's essentially the production shape that the solar farms would have. At a very high macro level, solar really is the cheapest energy, and I think it's safe to say it's probably the cheapest form of energy of all time. And the hydro systems built 100 years ago, once fully depreciated, were probably cheaper. But hydro is, to start new hydro now, it would be quite a lot more expensive than solar energy is. And so essentially the ability to take $1.20 per watt technology into a market and have it separated into the time period creates high value for the solar, but it also is extremely low cost in the big picture of energy. And the best way to express that is you could build an infinite number of solar farms for use in electric cars. And if you took the daytime price of our solar farms and converted it to a mile per gallon equivalent, it would be about 20 cents a liter equivalent. And that essentially is the biggest macro view of energy that you could have, because if you could build an infinite number of solar farms, you could create a source of energy that's roughly 10 times cheaper than petrol into a car. And so this macro picture that you see on the screen right now is essentially, if you want to get very kind of philosophical about it, the reason that there's so much excitement about solar power in the world today is that it ultimately can be built large scale and used to address global or climate change and the conversion to electric cars in the transportation side. Jumping back a little bit to the New Zealand market, this is a picture of both the volatility in a year and the rising cost of electricity over the last 20 years. And so we see in this picture, the price differential between a dry year and a wet year here in New Zealand, and the kind of the standard deviation of that volatility. And of course, this is a graph in real 2020 dollars. So the price of electricity was rising for about 20 years here, based on gas prices and the addition of carbon into the price. And our view of the future is that trend will almost right on today, right on the beginning of the solar build out, that price curve will reverse itself. We think the increment additions of solar and wind and the driving out of gas and carb from the price will mean that 20 years from now, prices will return to where they were 20 years ago, in round numbers. And so very, very interesting market analysis here, that you essentially introduce carbon into a market, let technology catch up, use the technology to get rid of the carbon, and you effectively get prices back to where they were before the decisions were made to send those signals. So this will be a great story 20 years now to talk about that. The changes, of course, in that curve really come from an immediate drop in the price as new generation is coming in. Then electrification of cars will have some upward pressure on the price, and then eventually carbon is squeezed right out completely, and we have a carbon-free electricity market, substantially carbon-free electricity market at the end. I'm just going to wrap up with a couple of pictures of the solar farms themselves. We are building a battery ready system, so that when batteries are added in a second phase, we would be able to stick those batteries on the DC side of inverters. So the battery space at these 5 locations will ultimately be the cheapest form of battery storage you could have, because the inverters are essentially a sunk cost and there to bring the solar power to the market, and the battery simply just plugs into the back end of that. So we do expect all of these farms to have full battery technology, completely driven by market signals, in the fullness of time. We know quite a lot about solar and its ability to build fast. It uses low skilled labor. It doesn't have any pollution. It doesn't affect water. We tuck these farms in behind shelter belts and hide them from neighbors. There's no impact almost whatsoever with solar, and the fact that you can build in 6 months or less means that the process of building solar farms on a regular, repeated, as the electrification starts to happen, solar farms can go pretty much in a very tightly coordinated space as time goes on. Our initial capital plan is to build these 5 sites. Here's Lodestone 1. It's near Dargaville in the North Island, 90 gigawatt hours. Our second site is actually the first one to be constructed. It's a 60 gigawatt hour site in the far north. Lodestone 3 is in the Bay of Plenty. Lodestone 4 is also in the Bay of Plenty, and then finally Lodestone 5 will be built on the Coromandel Peninsula, which is kind of a holiday zone, and the electricity demand on the peninsula grows every summer, which will be almost an exact match for the increases that we'll have because of the summer season. So this particular one will be kind of a poster child of how to help how to use solar to help take the load off the transmission grid. So these 5 sites will be built under a capital program of $300 million. We're currently raising equity in a Series B round for that initial capital program, and we've got sites 6 and 7 starting to be lined up to be funded out of our cash flow once the first 5 are operational. So we expect the capital raising to be completed shortly, and sometime around March of 2022, we'll start the building of the 5 sites. We think of it all as one big project, and it would be phased over about a 24-month period. The interesting thing about solar is it's got a very high EBITDA multiple, so the cash flow coming off these sites will fuel a lot of growth, and we fully expect the ability to take the initial capital program, leverage it from the cash that's coming off of the initial 5 sites, and it's a kind of a nice growth path to $1 billion if you take the cash from the initial 5 sites and reinvest it in new production. You can get to a $1 billion valuation fairly quickly, and it's a pretty straightforward process. So just to summarize the solar future in New Zealand, we see it as being quite a big market. We're being about 400 gigawatt hours in our first 5 sites, but we see the market at being 3,000 to 5,000 gigawatt hours, and so with 80% of that likely to come from grid scale, there's quite a lot of opportunity for not only Lodestone but other solar developers in the marketplace. We think we can maybe get a little bit ahead of some of the other developers by our plan to the retail market, and certainly that market is available for everyone, but an early mover that has a retail product based on solar could have quite an advantage over any new entrant thereafter. We think will be a major part of New Zealand's getting to 100% renewable. We have no doubts that getting to 100% renewable will happen. There's no signal whatsoever that would suggest that we couldn't, and it also looks like the fastest path to create cheap energy for the electrification of transport, as I mentioned earlier. We do think there will be lots of competition, but having the ability to build on to an existing portfolio will be hopefully an advantage we can take into the future. And we think we have an excellent chance to get a good percentage, a good market share of that 3,000 to 5,000 gigawatt hours. With that, I'll stop talking, and I'm quite happy to take any questions.
Great. Okay, well, thanks for that, Gary. Just sort of, I guess the first question, there are many contrasts, of course, with Australia, where solar is, such a big part of the play there. And in that sort of vein, perhaps the first question is, in terms of your contracting model, I guess you've described a model where the market is supportive of solar. Do you think a PPA is essential to building solar in New Zealand, or do you think you could even build on purely merchant economics?
Well, the merchant model would work here. In fact, it would probably work if you were content to just half hourly price, because the volatility between dry years and wet years is fairly predictable, and willing to take the dry year, wet year differentials, then the market is essentially skewed to the dry side, so you'd probably do quite well if you could handle that volatility. We think it's better to remove the volatility and take the annual retail price as the major input, and because retail prices don't move very much, it's really just a slow reaction to some macro effects in the market. Retail is kind of the safest revenue stream you could find other than a PPA. And the problem, of course, with PPAs is you tend to be selling to your competition, and you end up being your strategic goals end up being linked to the appetite of the competition wanting to buy your power. And so taking it to the retail market as a pure alternative to the incumbents, puts you more in control of the growth path you want to plot. And so we think a PPA is a fine way to go, but it's not going to be as valuable as going directly to the retail market and plotting our own course.
Great, thanks. It's interesting. A couple of, again, a reflection from Australia. I saw recently sort of the target of potentially reaching $15 a megawatt hour break-even cost for solar. I'm assuming that's quite a long-term goal. I mean, how possible is that, do you think? I'm interested sort of in how much of the plant is balance of plant rather than the solar panels themselves these days.
Yeah, I mean, solar panels take up nearly half of the cost of a plant. So a movement in solar costs is helpful, but that would stimulate quite a lot of competition, and that would probably speed up the move to solar. It doesn't necessarily mean the retail price in the country would move down to that level or even close to it, because so much of the retail market price is driven by the actual half-hourly price, and solar being a price taker, it won't tend to move the half-hourly price by itself, and at least not for quite a long time. It would take quite a lot of volume for it to move the half-hourly price. Our four flights, for example, are only 1% of the market, so it definitely would be a price-taking environment for a long time. And to the extent that we are selling at retail, we then only care about the retail price and not really what the costs are. And if costs are dropping, then that just means our margins will get a little bigger. I'm not in the camp, though, that solar power will just continue to fall in cost. I think we probably are seeing the world kind of come to that point where now that solar is on par with grid costs, this manufacturing side might be less willing to continue to drive prices down and be more likely to try and capture some of their value back, because they know that it's already the cheapest form of energy available in the world. So I'm kind of in the camp where we're probably seeing solar prices and costs that are pretty much now where they'll stay for quite a long time.
Thank you. Your 3,000 to 5,000 gigawatt hours per annum for New Zealand, it doesn't sound like too tough a target. Sort of maybe 10% of the power system once you forward a decade. Do you see any issues? And obviously, this always comes up with solar in terms of those peak injections, though, the 3 gigawatts or so that it's injecting into the system at those peak times of day. Just your comments around how the power system in New Zealand can absorb that.
Yeah, the great thing about New Zealand's market is it's got a dominance of hydro, and quite a lot of that hydro has some short-term storage capability. And so as new generation sources like wind and solar come into the market, the hydro has an excellent ability to shape itself around the intermittency of solar and wind to kind of fill in the valleys of that intermittency, and it does so willingly, of course, because those valleys are exactly when the highest price periods would be available to that hydro resource. So the market is explicitly designed to allow intermittent renewable energy to blend in with historic renewable energy particularly if that historic renewable energy is hydro and it has some short-term storage capability.
Great, thanks. I mean, just follow on from that. I mean, do you think there's a peak to or a capacity limit to how much solar we could fit in New Zealand in the current design?
I mean, the limit here, unlike Australia or Canada or America, the limit here is land and capacity to kind of fit certain size projects into the transmission grid. You'll notice in our portfolio, we're kind of all sitting in that 40 gigawatt hour to 100 gigawatt hour bracket, and that's because the kind of the availability of land and the size of the interconnecting points become a constraint. So if there's a limit to solar in New Zealand, it'll be mostly because of land constraints and interconnection capacity constraints. But I think it's more likely to be driven by the point where thermal energy gets driven out of the system. Solar will have a good run until the thermal is gone, and then solar and hydro would be, and wind, of course, would be all adding to meet demand, and anything incremental after that would essentially have to fit with knowing that you're not squeezing thermal out, you're actually just meeting new demand with electrification or population growth.
I mean, one of the questions, and it seems to have been a big issue also in Australia, or a big opportunity in Australia, is on the one hand you're seeing that carbon-intensive activities, mining, for example, are seeing much greater difficulty in trying to obtain financing from banks, other forms of debt raising. Is the converse true for you with the solar venture? Are you seeing it easier and cheaper funding available?
Yeah, we're taking an interesting approach as we, the tradition with solar around the world has been to take bid into a government RFP or try to jump into a feed-in tariff scenario. And if you know there's a kind of a government guarantee on the other side of your revenue stream, then the tendency is to drive the levelized cost of electricity down to be competitive. And so that usually means you put a lot of leverage on the asset. Our approach is to put light leverage on, maybe put debt financing on it that's not dissimilar to the debt equity ratios that vertically integrated generators have. So we're more inclined to try and around that 50% debt equity blend. And of course that when you're willing to take less leverage, then getting the financing gets easier. And so we think we've struck a chord with our retail strategy. It's merchant, but it's not really, because it's got the stability of the retail market behind it, and a light loading of the balance sheet with debt is kind of the perfect mix of risk and financing. And I suspect when we build these 5, as long as we can kind of keep that thick equity piece in there, we'll have a pretty time getting more financing over time.
Great. Thank you very much. What do you think the dependence is for the 100% renewable strategy on transmission capacity upgrades? And I guess, given the location of your sites, have you sort of taken advantage of any slowness of having transmission expanded in the country? Your thoughts about that?
Yeah, there's no doubt we picked the low-hanging fruit first, and we're tucking into pockets of the grid that actually create kind of a benefit to the grid. As bigger sites get contemplated and as more sites get contemplated, the cost of transmission will become a fairly big part of the decision making, and the transmission policy may have to change a little bit to get the get the market to really respond to 100% renewable objectives. And we don't see it being a problem for the next sort of 10 years, but that after we get to the harder end of the grid, then there'll probably be some policy decisions that have to be made to keep it going. But I'm confident the government and Transpower and the EA will all be kind of working in the same direction there.
Because we're talking NZ electricity, is sort of inevitable. We have to ask the question, well, two questions actually. One's less important than it once was, but transmission pricing methodology, segueing from that previous answer, there around avoided cost of transmission, do you think is a missed opportunity or potentially a threat to your model?
Yeah, I think there's lots of there's a lot of dynamics on moving power from the South Island to the North Island, and as big things happen, like the retirement of thermal energy, then that's going to cause the grid to get balanced in a different way. And building assets north of Auckland or in the immediate term better than building them in the South Island and trying to get them up to the center of Auckland. That all is going to have to be looked at pretty carefully over time, because you may want to invest in transmission for the goal of getting 100% renewable after the system is kind of getting constrained again. But like I said, I think that the transmission pricing, it's changed fairly consistently over the decades already as different dynamics have happened in the market, and I expect that it'll remain fairly malleable by regulators to kind of make sure that the overall objectives of the market are maintained.
Great, thank you. And the other part of the obligatory question to ask, really, in the New Zealand context, is the Lake Onslow pumped hydro scheme. Obviously, a bit of a giant potentially on the horizon, probably for next decade. What are your thoughts around that, sort of as it affects sort of your company, but also from a market perspective?
Well, having government-owned assets in a deregulated free market is always something that should be very carefully analyzed, and probably, if you could make policy decisions to not let it happen, you should probably choose to do those. I see it as a bit of an insurance idea. It'll hang out there as an idea maybe for quite a long time. And maybe the very present keeps people looking at market-based ideas that keep it pushed out into the future. There's lots of good ideas that could come along. I'm personally quite a fan of the potential for offshore wind, and I think one of the things we'll be talking about regularly about 10 years from now is the growth in offshore wind generation that could happen here. You can imagine a wind turbine sitting in the Cook Strait would pretty much be 24/7 production, and if you had offshore wind off the coast of Manukau Heads, you could have Auckland supplied quite nicely with some steady power. And so I think the solution is probably hidden in offshore wind and probably some hydrogen production on shore that allowed ideas like Onslow to be perpetually put off, and so that the government doesn't have to participate in the market just for the insurance of a really dry year. And so I'm very optimistic the market will bring solutions to the table.
A great way to finish. Thank you. I share your optimism. So thank you very much, Gary. Extremely informative presentation. That concludes this session, but please keep watching. We have another session starting at 2:15. We've got Powering Australian Renewables presenting, hosted by Dane Fitzgibbon. Thank you.